I think people have already started to take a step back and consciously unplug, or as Gwyneth Paltrow says, consciously uncouple.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Hull. Welcome to the Roundtables, presented by iProspect. Today we'll be speaking with Dave Niwe from IBM, Jillian Ryan from eMarketer, Ken Blum from Buzzfeed, Tanya Dua from Business Insider, Adrian Cutler from Microsoft, and Kathy Taylor from WARC. Thank you for joining us today as we talk about marketing in the year 2030. That title always makes me think of the old Conan O'Brien, in the year 2000, right?
Yes.
So, Terry Pratchett, the famous English author, once said, if you don't know where you've been, you don't know where you are. If you don't know where you are, you don't know where you're going. And if you don't know where you're going, you're probably not going right. So before we dive into the next 10 years and where marketing is going to go, let's take a minute to reflect on what's happening today and what brands are succeeding. So let's start the conversation. Which brands have succeeded in embracing digital transformation of today and have set themselves up for tomorrow? And what are the brands that are failing, missing out on? What can they pivot to?
You know, at eMarketer, we generally see that the high-tech companies, which we have several seated at our table right now, so IBM, Microsoft, the SAPs of the world, are doing a great job. And that's because they're equipped with budget and innovative thinking. The brands that aren't doing well, I will not name names, I leave that to my fellow colleagues at the table, but I think that what they can be doing is not necessarily focusing too much on the technology, which I know is important and I know we'll be talking about on this panel, but really thinking about the internal stuff that they need to take care of, the kind of backstage elements that are going to enable a digital transformation. So we think of that as people. Do we have the right skill set? Processes? Are we enabled to collaborate? Are we sharing the right information internally? And partners, who are we working with? What are our platforms? What are our agencies? What skills do they have? And getting that kind of internal stuff sorted, because that's what's going to enable that transformative vision and thinking moving forward. And you can't adopt a new technology if you don't have the right skill set internally, if you're not working towards the same vision.
And I would add that, Jillian, too. I think a lot of the brands that are doing this well are given the latitude and the sort of permission to experiment with a lot of this new technology and offerings that are available. I think, having been on the brand side, I'm all too familiar with the fact that there are a lot of vendors out there, and then particularly in this day and age, there's a lot of talk about AI and a lot of buzzwords being thrown out there. And I think people need to be given the permission to actually take those risks, and if they don't work out, that's fine, you can fail quickly and then move on. But I think the brands that actually have some money set aside for innovation, regardless of what that ROI is, are the ones that are going to probably see the best return.
And I also sort of, to me, it's sort of a baseline, metric from personally when I'm looking at the brands I like, are you making it easy for me to do business with you? And there's a lot of like back end, components to that. But as much as we all trot out Apple and Amazon, for instance, as examples of that, I just find that consumers, including myself, but just our bar keeps going higher and higher and higher for our expectation of how easy or hard it is to be able to do business with somebody. And a brand that isn't available to me 24/7 just does not win.
Right. I will say, to your point, Jillian, the brands that are doing it right have the backing of the leadership. I was at a conference last week, and a top executive from Kellogg was talking about how the way you get that leverage is by proving things out. And I have noticed in my reporting that the brands that are doing it well are people that are taking little steps. It's not about this huge digital overhaul. It's about doing one little thing, proving that it works, and then getting more and more leverage from the leadership. I'm not afraid to name names. I cover this stuff all the time. I will say, from an innovation standpoint, there's a lot of people trying to do this and do this effectively. Some people are doing incubators in-house because they think it's the buzzy thing to do, not necessarily. But one company I think that's doing things well is Anheuser-Busch. They have a whole dedicated unit called ZX Ventures, which is about building for the future. So one of the things that we had a chance to check out recently was this cocktail maker with Keurig So they're basically, instead of coffee pods, they're making, margarita pods. Obviously, they don't taste great right now, but it's something I would spend $400 on because I don't want a bartender when I'm hosting people at my apartment, but it would be nice to have a cocktail maker, right?
I think that's a great example of a brand that's like doing a great job of listening to the consumers and really anticipating need, which is like a charter of a marketer. And I think that's another sort of key indicator of brands that will be successful in terms of looking towards the future, is kind of just being 2 steps ahead of their consumers and understanding.
But they miss White Claw.
Right, yes, they completely missed White Claw, yes.
2019.
Just buy it.
Yes.
But maybe that's too far in the past.
Well, if we're talking about Anheuser-Busch, they have Bon and Viv. They're just like, marketing it weirdly with like mermaids and stuff when White Claw's clearly for the bros.
But you're right actually about that connected to the consumer as well. So I'd give a shout out to Unilever. It was actually a couple of years ago at Cannes where the CMO stood up and talked about the inclusion journey and how that they found that they could connect to their consumers by putting real people in the advertising.
Yep.
So just a simple thing. And as he said, wherever you are on this inclusion journey, because it's a personal journey as much as anything, just look at the business benefit. There's a significant amount of money to be made there. So for me, that connection to the consumer, I think, is really key. The brands that are getting it right have realised who their consumer is, what they need to do internally, how they need to connect not only with their own internal people on new innovations, but also with the external audience. So.
I think budget's a big part of it too. The brands that I've seen be the most successful implement what's called like a 70-20-10 rule. Yeah. So like 70% of the budget is the stuff that works, we know it works, email, we've been doing it for years, it's successful, we're still optimizing it, but it's performing. And then 20 is kind of newer stuff, but it's tried and true at this point. And the 10% is, it doesn't matter what the ROI is, just throw it at the wall, see what sticks, and then that 10% can eventually grow, but knowing that you're allocating 10% of your budget to try the craziest, most outlandish stuff and not being measured against that right away, I think is a good step to drive transformation internally.
But I think one of the things, the question's interesting because most people are saying retargeting is working, and that might not be around in 2030. And so like if you shift all your budget and even organizational structure to people that are doing more cookie-based or programmatic, like you have to actually be planning for what are deeper partnerships or how do you actually build brands when there's less data that's available.
I think go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, I think, you bring up like a great point, Ken. I think like as we think about like what's gonna happen in the next 10 years, I just spend a lot of time wondering about how we will resolve this tension between the desire for personalization and yet kind of like the rollback and sort of like conservatism around privacy and sort of regulations that are being put in place that make it harder for consumers to share information that would result in more personalized advertising. So like how does that resolve itself?
Yeah. Right, it's almost like a step back. Someone this morning that I was interviewing referred to it as Mad Men 2.0.
Yep.
Not so much, but of course that's changed in that people still expect that level of personalization and customization, but then yes, you're gonna be soon confronting a reality where it's a cookie-less world, and then all your retargeting is gonna fall flat.
I mean, sometimes technology makes us lazy, and that's okay, and I think it's actually a good thing that this is going to be something that maybe will spark more innovation because it's not as easy a layup to get the conversion.
It's also a value exchange as well, though, isn't it? I'd be willing to give more of my information based on what value I'm going to get, as long as that brand or entity that I'm engaging with is transparent about what they're really doing with that data on that value exchange. So for me, I think that's really key.
Yeah, sorry. But you also have to wonder where that pendulum is going to wind up, because on the other hand, maybe people will realize that there are some really good things that come with personalization, but there may be another thing that goes like, no, let's go back to mass marketing. I mean, I was watching a panel yesterday, and it was all like, we're going to have to learn how to target broadly again, and maybe you all agree with that, maybe you don't, but I think there is going to be a segment, at least of the audience, that is like kind of fine with, I don't need you to know who I am, and send me all the, serve me all the bad ads that have nothing to do with me that you want, as long as you're not, invading my privacy.
I think it also has to do with, what consumer section you're targeting. So I was moderating this really interesting panel yesterday, which was tied to this Adobe study, but basically it was about what millennials expect, what boomers expect, what Gen Zers expect, what Gen Xers expect. And I had two millennials, so two 25-year-olds, three 75-year-olds, and one 50-year-old on the panel. And you could see that division in how they think, because the millennials were agreeing with what you just said, which is that it's a value exchange. We know that we're giving up this to get something in return. And of course, the older folks were not very keen on that. So, well, you have to think of who your consumer in 2030 is going to be. And I also think like demographics don't necessarily work. I don't know how you define that consumer, but you have to obviously keep that top of mind.
I think that's a great point, Tanya, particularly when you consider that I think by around 2035, there's going to be more people that are 65 and older than there are people under 18. I think there'll be around 78 million folks that are 65 plus and around 76.7 under the age of 18. So there's just going to be more aging people as the society continues to age. People are living longer, and that's going to have a major impact on how we think about mass marketing and what that consumer base really looks like.
I guess the question is, what does that 65-year-old look like in the future? Are they more comfortable? Is privacy really a concern for the consumer, or is privacy just more a benefit of the Google and Facebook of the world? And that's the thing that I think is even more challenging for advertisers to navigate.
I think it gets interesting too when you think about the evolution of the cookie and the changing way that data is shared and how some of the walled gardens are going to benefit. But also the other trend I'm seeing is a lot of brands really doubling down on their own data and spending some time to curate their first-party data, to further segment it, to augment it, and even to bring other things in-house. Like there's an in-housing trend. It seems to go in waves and it affects different channels of execution, but I think we're seeing more brands with an aspiration to bring this specialism in-house. Do you think that that's a trend that's going to continue to grow, owning your own data, owning your own execution, kind of owning the advertising process start to finish? Where do you think that's going to be in 2030?
Yeah, I mean, at eMarketer, we certainly see brands bringing not just programmatic and advertising in-house, but all aspects of their marketing. And I think, to your point, that is about ownership. It is about being closer to the customer. I mean, being closer to the data, which then leads to being closer to the customer. So marketers are working on that. But I think, you mentioned a pendulum swinging before. Yeah. And I think that metaphor applies to this as well. There are a lot of flexible engagement models. And when we say in-housing, that doesn't mean that a brand won't be working with an agency partner. It just means that they might take some of the capability and the capacity and bring it inside. And it also doesn't mean that they're going to have an in-house agency. It might just mean that they hire another team that's going to collaborate with their agency. So in-housing, there's a lot of gray area in what that means. But yes, at the end of the day, brands are doing that so that they could have more ownership and that they can control the money better and their customers better.
To your point, Jillian, it looks like a lot of different things. There's companies that have come up that essentially help marketers just figure out what their in-housing model looks like, because no two companies have the same model. There's Oliver based out of the UK that you were mentioning, Keith Weed and Unilever, and he's a big proponent of. The other thing, though, is I think we've reached a tipping point that, yes, that's about more ownership, but there are some brands that are doing it for the wrong reasons. They're doing it because it's cheap, and that in itself is not the right motivation to do it, and they're realizing that it's way harder than they thought it would be. So I think we're going to see that, you were talking about how this happens in waves, we're actually going to see like a little bit of a downfall now that so many people, I think over 70% in the last 2 years of marketers have done some form of in-housing. But when you reach that tipping point, they'll run into problems soon enough.
Yeah, and agencies are, continue.
No, go on, please.
I was going to say, agencies are always going to be relevant. So even if brands are in-housing programmatic right now, which was a new thing a decade ago, there's going to be the thing in 2030 that they're not going to understand that they'll need to lean on their partners for.
Yeah. And you can't talk about 2030 without talking about AI. And if we're talking about that in-housing and what that really means, PwC did some analysis recently that I thought was quite fascinating. That they found out that by 2030, there's going to be sort of $15.7 trillion of additional revenue generated globally, and actually 6.6 trillion of that will be through in-house sort of automation tools and how brands are using and utilizing things. And by 2030, they're thinking that it's more sort of like the hours of workforce is 50-50 between hours of people and hours of robots or AI working, which is fascinating. I mean, talk about amplifying human ingenuity, that really frees us up to think about these different things.
let's dig into AI for a minute, because as someone who works at an agency, I'm glad to hear you think in-housing isn't going to cost me my job, but are the robots going to cost me my job? No, I feel like with AI, there's a lot of excitement. There's a lot of buzz right now between AI, machine learning, all the different tool sets that were available. But I also think there's a little bit of disillusionment happening because we've been talking about AI for over 50 years. And I feel like today what we have is actually just a minimal viable product.
Yes.
Like, it's not bad, but it's definitely not scalable, and it's not an easy button. You plug in a machine learning algorithm and your first result is probably not going to be that great. And I think a lot of people get disillusioned by that. So looking ahead in 10 years, where do you think we'll realistically be as far as AI amplified marketing and machine learning powered teams?
Quantum computing. So for me, so far out there thinking now on 2030, but for me, it's coming, it's already here in some ways. So I feel that quantum computing will actually be quantum advertising, because it will give the AI the power it needs to be more than just a young child learning, that will actually give it the amplification it needs. So I look at it in the way of, imagine like some of the cognitive AIs that exist today. They can look at your video assets and tell you what's going on with that video asset. They can look at your images and tell you what's going on there. There's a person that they're happy, they're in a park. Then you overlay like performance data, and in theory you can then figure out what the perfect creative is for that brand. But it's based on the creative assets it has. And the AI would take a lot of learning to be able to understand about our own human failings. So if there's already unconscious bias built into that video asset, all you're doing is creating more assets that the data says is good, but is actually a failing of our own humanity. And if you're not deliberately including, it's called unconscious for a reason, you exclude. So actually, my hope and vision for this is that with quantum advertising, we would be able to give these AIs, these cognitive AIs, the power to sort of correct our own human failings and be able to create advertising that is better and more inclusive than it is today.
So it'll be a lot more than those annoying messenger chatbots.
Yeah, exactly.
I sincerely hope so. Yeah.
But you're not speaking to anything that different than the Facebook newsfeed and what biases were created from that algorithm, right?
Right.
And so I just think like it's tonality and what is happening in the world that AI is missing, but that's why you need humans to be massaging that and being a layer in between.
Hence all our jobs are
right.
safe.
Exactly. They're all safe.
The humans are safe.
So, but I also wonder, it's so funny because, what works can change a lot over time. So it's almost like, to what extent does it become sort of like this works and this is what works, and then everybody as a consumer looks at it as wallpaper again, like this is advertising, and then so it's got to iterate like beyond kind of like. Like consumers are always ahead of technology. I know people don't always believe that, but I do wonder kind of sometimes like, so okay, define what works, like, and what are the components of an ad that works, and how do those change over time?
I think, yeah, like Ken, to your point, I think like one of the things about AI that I find most sort of promising is that from my work at IBM with Watson, I've seen kind of the best results happen when man and machine are actually working harmoniously. And I think one of the things that, and maybe I blame the hoverboard from Back to the Future 2 for kind of like misaligning people's expectations about what the future would really look like, is that I think people had a misconception that like AI would just always tell them like 100% this is the answer and this is what you go with, and like you don't need any kind of human intervention to check that. That's not really the case. Like the purpose of AI is to help save time, improve efficiencies, and come up with a suggestion that is based on some, sort of informed analysis that like a human can then intervene and decide, okay, like does this make sense? And I think the one thing that AI can't provide that humans are uniquely positioned to do is empathy. And I think that without that, like AI will not really have any power whatsoever. So I think that dependency on some sort of human interaction will persist, I think, definitely through 2030 and beyond.
Whether it's IBM, Microsoft, or any of the others, I think we all have a responsibility here to build it the right way.
Yeah.
That it does amplify us as humans, that it does do good. So I think we have an accountability on that.
And how do you think that's going to happen? Because every time there's some sort of an alliance in marketing and media, it kind of falls flat. How do you envision that? I'm sorry, I'm playing the journalist role here, but I'm just thinking about it. What would that look like?
Yeah.
Cool. I mean, for me, I think it's, yes, okay, you need to have boards, you need to have alignments on strategy and core goals, but it's also like, to your point about like the human element, that if you're going to build something in AI, run it through a human panel. Like, is this okay? Is this the right thing? And I liken it back to sort of Sheo Ice and, you know, some of our other ventures in this space with Tay. That, you know, I liken the difference, and I don't know if you're familiar with the two, but I look at the two, like Sheo Ice has like 50 million daily interactions. If you have an emotional breakup, we'll check in with you, make sure you're all right. So to the point about, you know, it's got that EQ, that emotional intelligence, not to the same extreme of a human, but it has. Whereas with Tay, you know, was set off in the space and to learn from humanity, and unfortunately adapted some of the darker side of humanity. So the difference between the two is really, the way I look at it is, Sheo Ice had parents to like check back in. So we were the parents of like, hey, I just heard this, is that okay? No, it's not okay. Don't go down that route. Or, yeah, that's great, you can build on that and you can learn from that. So I think it comes down to a point of that human element of, you know, how do we really, as trusted, transparent brands that are accountable for this development, really hold that human in high regard. But then also to my starting point that, you know, actually I still feel that there's a benefit of AI to capture our own and build on our own failings of unconscious bias.
So thinking back to tying a couple of threads together, we talked about, you know, expectations of privacy and the value exchange of data. I think, you know, one of the other outcomes of AI isn't just interacting with consumers, it's also being able to analyze the data. So I've read a stat from Forrester not long ago that 90% of the data collected by marketers is never actually analyzed. And so AI is going to allow us to plug into that, but I think AI is going to grow at a geometric pace and want more data. And of course, we're going to have more data coming in because we have more points of interaction between the physical and digital world. There's video and facial recognition. There's the data that we're sharing by, you know, carrying around our smartphones at all times and the apps that we use and whatnot. So how do you see the value exchange playing out 10 years from now with the customers of that age and all the data they're putting out finally matched with the capability of AI to analyze that data and deliver personalization? Do you think that there's a line that people are going to draw as far as which of their data should be used for personalization and which shouldn't?
I definitely think that, you know, lines will be drawn. And, you know, as much as I love the digital world, and I think most of us do, you know, what's been really interesting, you know, with the past 5 years or so is sort of the great realization on the parts of consumers about all the data we're putting out there, to a certain extent, how it's being used. And, you know, getting back to the pendulum, you know, it could swing a couple of different ways, you know, by the time we get to 2030. But I think people are going to really kind of demand that, you know, certain sort of like walls be put up in their own lives around, you know, not just data, but also devices in general. I mean, there's been a number of studies now about, you know, the so-called like techlash. But you know, the thing is that, you know, all the technologies that have come before have kind of put us in a similar place where, you know, it's out there, and it to a certain extent gets like with the mobile phone, like people didn't really realize what that was going to do to our day-to-day lives. And a lot of it's great. But we also are kind of realizing, well, wait, we're giving out all this data, we're on this thing all the time. So I think 2030 is going to look quite a bit different. You can't spend more time on your phone than you are right now.
Yeah, it's like some crazy stat, like 12 hours or something like that for some categories.
Wow.
And
it's going up according to eMarketer.
Yeah.
And it's I think people have already started to take a step back and consciously unplug. Or as Gwyneth Paltrow says, consciously uncouple. And that's because you're right. It takes like a toll on your health, on your mental health, on like even right now walking up to this you know event. I was on my phone. I was answering Slack and I was on email, and I'm like, when do I unplug? And I was with this old couple in a cab, and they were just like sitting and looking outside, and he's like, did you see this building? It's like been reconstructed. And I'm like, oh my God, my mind is going through 50 things right now, and I don't have the luxury to just sit back and like look outside. So I think, to your point, people have already started pulling back.
Yeah, and data is part of that analysis of what these devices are, you know, how these devices are part of our lives. It's not just about the device, it's about the data that we're putting out there.
But my hope for the marketer angle is that AI enables them to leverage data, because at the end of the day, right now, there's a lot of really cool data we could be using, but most of our campaigns are built off of an impression-based MMM model that none of us really agree with.
Yeah.
And so can AI be that thing that allows us to enable better marketing or enable better effectiveness?
Yeah, and actually the World Economic Forum did some analysis that in only about 3 years' time, so 2022, that there will be 58 million net new jobs globally that are AI focused. So I completely agree with you that it's like, how does that enable a marketer, but also then with that ability and that power that actually it creates net new positions, as we need to conceptualize and understand this in a deeper way.
Are those more like tech positions or marketing positions?
Yeah, so they're pretty broad, that it's just the AI ecosystem.
Because
Pretty
I
broad.
see the marketer and the technologist kind of merging
absolutely.
as one. And I think while creative and brand are super important, and I could talk about that forever, like we can't lose that art, but you need to have that data science skill as well in order to even just understand how to use AI to enable better advertising.
I think we're seeing some of that happen in the resurgence of out of home again.
Yep.
I know there's some, people that do this, and I'm skipping on the names, but they have these posters and they're digitized, and depending on your eye movement tracking, they'll be able to say how engaged you were. And so to your point, that's using technology and AI to sort of get deeper insights.
There are some stadiums that actually use biometrics and recognition like that to see the demographic of who's in the surrounding area, and then they update the image based on that, which is cool as a marketer, but as a person attending a Mets game, I don't know how excited I am.
Or that's
about
that 10% of spend, right?
Yeah,
I guess.
It's not actually, the 90% of spend is still on really antiquated models for measurement.
And I think there's also, the opportunity to share data in aggregate for the greater good. So whenever I think of biometrics data, it kind of creeps me out on the marketing side of things, but when you think about sharing that for quicker diagnosis of disease, identification of cancers, that is incredibly powerful, and that data set could be incredibly rich. And so I think it's an interesting balance, but of course that implies a level of trust. If I'm sharing that with someone, is their database secure? Are they going to share it somewhere? Are they going to eventually sell it to someone and then tie that back?
Are they going to be Facebook and allow others to scrape all that data?
Yeah. And there's an implicit understanding, and I think it's going to have to become much more explicit as consumers are more savvy and as they're getting used to understanding the value exchange of these type of data contracts.
And what does inaccuracy in those things mean too? And the reason I say that is Facebook thinks I'm my sister. We're 5 years apart, but every time she's somewhere, it's you've been tagged in a photo, and I'm like, nope. That's my sister. So so that's a funny example.
Yeah.
But if there are serious implications, such as a health diagnosis,
Or
what does that mean? Yeah, it's used for law enforcement all the time.
Yeah.
TSA is, and there's a lot of implications for the travel industry with airlines and hotels using fingerprints to let you in the room, which is cool. But it's what if you're wrong?
Right.
And you were talking earlier about the rising expectations. I think it's an interesting tension that people will complain about marketers having too much information, and yet when there's an inaccurate ad, they'll think it's funny and want to share it. Come on, guys, don't you know me better than that? So it's a little bit of that expectation is there.
Guilty as charged. I did that with an email yesterday where someone called me Brooke.
But do you think that maybe in response, I feel like the trend in our industry is to generally use technology to solve for the problems that technology is itself creating. So I kind of wonder, and you start to see some of this with the interest in paper ballots as an example, but sort of a return to analog kind of as a general industry trend. I think that's a potential thing that we could see in the next 11 years or so as people look for sort of cleaner ways to attribute and sort of more data privacy. I think some of those analog methods printed campaigns, sort of direct mail might see an increase in popularity.
That'll become your 10% right there.
Yeah.
No, it reminds me
How
of-
does direct mail work?
Right.
No,
And it
reminds
does
me
work.
of 10 years ago, there was a trend where you go out to dinner with your friends and everyone puts their phone in the center of the table face down.
Right.
And the first person who picks up the phone has to pick up the check. And that worked well
I like
10
that.
years ago, but
Right.
now you've got your watch connected, you've got all these other things, you got your earbuds.
Right.
I mean, in 10 years, you'll probably have a contact lens that has that information. So
Yep.
more connectivity, I think, just creates more opportunities for distraction.
Which was already shown in, what's that show? Westworld? No,
Yes.
not
Yeah.
Westworld.
Well,
No, the other one. What's the other one? Oh my God.
Black Mirror?
Black Mirror.
Well, no, I think maybe I'm like drinking the Kool-Aid too much, but I think in the best case scenario, AI, if it's designed in the right way, could actually be geared to actually help us save time in finding those efficiencies that actually let us disconnect more and spend more time with, like, say, our families or people that we haven't talked to forever because we're so hyper-connected. And I think that if like AI systems are designed the right way and to really sort of complement the sort of man and machine sort of paradigm, then I think we could actually see some real benefit in terms of actually allowing us to disconnect.
So we need technology to help us disconnect from technology.
Yes.
Technology solving the problems technology
Yeah,
creates.
here we are
Okay,
again. Yeah,
there we go.
Exactly.
But I think it's about finding the right signals around that are utility. So we think a lot about affiliate deals is not about, you know, driving more shopping. It's about somebody getting something that they wanted like the next day.
Yeah.
And that's a real human signal that we can actually make more content. And I just think that's the tipping point of we're not going to be making content for views and eyeballs or to like show another ad to somebody. It's going to be about getting them to actually do something different.
To actually take action rather
Yeah.
than just passively receive.
Which you like normally would not have seen that happen, right? Because technology now allows us to see what people have purchased and how they purchased it, we can optimize how we're actually making that content.
So how do you think purchasing and commerce are going to be different in 10 years? We've already got this, you know, almost unbelievable expectation of short shipping times, of the ability to buy anything you want right that moment on your phone, of algorithms that predict what you're going to buy next. We've got subscription services so you can make a purchase and never have to think about that product again for the rest of your life. It'll just keep coming to you. What is commerce going to look like, and commerce and fulfillment and the relationship between brands and consumers in 10 years?
Is that the Amazon Go store? That's a pretty good blueprint, I would say. I personally hate shopping, especially for clothes. I know exactly what I want, and I know exactly where to go, and I get the right recommendations there, ASOS. But the Amazon Go store, if in case I need to pick up something when I'm heading for, you know, out of town for a flight, and I have 2 seconds or whatever, okay, 2 minutes, I go to an Amazon Go store or something along those lines where I know exactly where what is, and I just get it and scan it myself and go. But the scanning technology, as we all know, sucks right now. So of course there need to be technological developments backing that as well.
I think it's about removing barriers for consumers, whether that's in a brick and mortar execution that Tanya just spoke about, or even online. So for example, I think about the sharing economy being such a huge part of D2Cs. It's really disrupting retail in general. For example, this shirt is rented. I do not own it. I've been using a subscription service for the last 4 years to get clothes delivered to my door. And more consumers, I think, are going down that path. You don't want to have to go to a store and try to find something, just have it come to you. I think that has implications in retail as well, and the kind of old inventory-led retailers that are brick and mortar need to take account that that's happening in online commerce and figure out how they create in-store experiences that are not only frictionless, but are experiential or entertaining. So like a showroom or like a pop-up, those are the things that are happening in the physical world that I think reflect the shifts that are happening online.
And those that aren't taking that into account, you can see are already going bust. So the retail apocalypse is real.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I think it was the New York Department of Transportation just released a study that said New Yorkers, on average, 45% of New Yorkers get something delivered once per week. So they've incorporated that into their. There you go.
Cut that.
No, it makes it easy. It used to having a large availability of product in store that you could get in that moment. That used to be a differentiator. That isn't anymore. It's almost like, you know, too much choice. Just give me what I want. And by the way, you should know what I want because we've had that value exchange.
Also, free 2-day shipping is table stakes now. Like 1-day shipping is where it's at.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, I want it now. Well, I recently had to read a bunch of marketing books, and this one that blew me away that kind of gets to all of this is this book called Disrupting, the Customer Value Chain, and it's written by a Harvard professor, Thales Teixeira. I don't know if I said that right. Anyway, the premise of the book is that we've had this customer value chain forever, and what all of these new verticals are doing is stripping out other parts of the chain that used to lead you to go to the store to buy your shirt. And it's kind of unifies like all of these verticals that we've seen, from Uber to Stitch Fix, to Blue Apron. And the more you look at all these new businesses, the more I'm like, well, this actually applies to so many different things, because you may not have time to go to the store, you may not like going to the grocery store to buy things, but you may like to cook. So we'll just focus on cooking. And you can see that obviously happening now, and that will probably become more and more refined going forward.
I think that's interesting, giving people the choice of which things that they do find value in and which ones that they just want to set aside and table. So we've covered a lot of topics here. Wanted to wrap up by, we've talked a lot about what we think will happen, and some of that's been good, some of that has been I want to move toward a more hopeful close. So let's go around and let's talk about what you hope will be the reality for marketing in 2030. What technologies or activations, where should we be aiming for and aspiring to?
We talked about AI. I think augmented reality is something we skipped, and I think that is where it's at. Sure, the dancing hot dogs were fun, and those building things that Snap is doing is fun, and I know they've been trying this out with those partnerships with Amazon and whatever, but they really, not they, but anyone with a decent AR setup needs to really double down on that. If I see the shirt and I like it, Jillian, I want to be able to take that screenshot, order it right away. And that's AR working in real time for you.
Yeah, Tanya, I think you're totally right. I think particularly with your previous point about what's going on with retail, and we're seeing kind of the, not demise of retail, but definitely sort of a dip down in the sort of prevalence. It just puts a lot more pressure on brands to create sort of a brand experience using other channels. And I think that the use of AR is a really smart way to actually bring to life an actual product that sort of looks as close to physical as possible, so you can actually kind of touch, see, feel what it would look like in your apartment, as an example. But I feel like that's the technology that I think could really bridge and sort of fill the void that is left by retail sort of being in decline.
And bridging on that, I think at eMarketer, we're really excited about 5G and what the implications of that technology can be. And I think that'll enable some very cool AR executions, a lot better video ads. We're a long way from that. I think that there's a lot of hype right now about it, and all the telecom companies are like 5G evolution, but we're a couple of years away. But down the road, I think that there's some great things that marketers are going to be able to do with the lower latency and the more efficient networks, for sure.
Yeah, my hope is that pendulum does swing back as we get disrupted around things being the way they are today, which is pretty low-hanging fruit and easy. How do we get into more direct partnerships and more understanding of what the consumer really wants? That's all enabled by technology, but I think the piece that's missing is, as it's really easy, do we give up on that piece?
For me, you only have to look at the rise of the voice of one, empowering all school kids to step out and say, I'm not okay with what we're doing on the climate. So I'd love to see that actually how AI and marketing is positioned in a way, given the power of quantum computing, to allow consumers to have a real choice, to understand what that real chain of commerce really is and what has positive and negative impact to humanity, whether that's climate or whatever. So, whether it's the demise of plastics or the change of a jet engine. I saw the Sabre thing that's coming out shortly by 2030. But to be able to use that quantum-powered AI to truly understand that full value chain, so that people like Greta can make an informed purchase choice.
More transparency.
Exactly, yeah. So for me, that's key. I think that would be my ideal by 2030.
Well, it's interesting. This kind of touches on what you said, but I think going forward, and we're certainly seeing this now, this much greater sort of social consciousness on the part of brands. And I was at the session the other day with Mark Pritchard from P&G, and it's really fascinating, if you've been following a company like that for a long time, to see them just taking issues on and trying to do things about them. And I think between sort of a higher corporate consciousness, which is not necessarily about technology, and the ability of technology to sort of solve problems and crowdsource solutions and all that's really something that I'm looking forward to in the next 10 years.
Thank you so much for such a spirited conversation, for digging into these opportunities. And on behalf of iProspect, thanks for taking the time. And open invitation, if you want to meet back here in 10 years, and see where we landed.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right.